Hello and welcome to the Peony Patterns YouTube channel. My name is Ashley and I am the sew along host here at Peony Patterns. So today we are going to be sewing the Myrtle dress together. So Myrtle features a beautiful and elegant wide neck and the most stunning puff sleeves. If you don't already own the Myrtle pattern, I will pop a link in the description box below where you can go ahead and purchase the pattern. Once you have purchased the pattern and have it printed, we are now ready to begin sewing. So here are all my pattern pieces cut and prepared ready for my Myrtle dress. So firstly, I have my two puff sleeve main pieces cut. So they are cut on the fold and are in my main fabric. Then I have my two puff sleeve lining pieces cut here. They are also cut on the fold and they are cut in my lining fabric. Then I have cut two front bodice pieces, so I've cut one in my main fabric and the other in my lining. That pattern piece is also cut on the fold. Then I have four back bodice pieces cut, so two in my main and two in my lining fabric, and they are cut as a mirrored image set of each other. I have also gone ahead and marked my button placement marks onto the left side of my main back bodice piece as well. And then lastly, we have our skirt pieces cut. So I have one of those cut for the front of my skirt and then two cut for the back. And you will notice that there is no pattern pieces to cut your skirt out with, as all of the measurements for the skirts are in the cutting chart on page 13 of the Myrtle pattern. So that is all of the pieces that you will need cut and prepared for today, ready to start sewing tomorrow. So to begin the construction of our Myrtle dresses, we are firstly going to be working on the left back bodice main piece, and we are going to be marking out our 4 buttonholes using a removable sewing marker. So using my pattern piece as a guide, I have gone ahead and marked out my 4 buttonholes using an air erasable marker onto my left back bodice main piece. And now we are going to connect our 2 back bodice pieces to our front bodice main piece. So this is my front bodice main piece here, right sides up. We are then going to take one of our back bodice pieces. We are then going to place that right sides together and aligning the corresponding shoulder up now with our front bodice main piece, and then repeat that for our second back bodice piece as well. So flipping that so that they are right sides together and aligning our shoulder seams. And now heading to the sewing machine, we are going to be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to sew where we have pinned at the shoulders. Once sewn, we are now going to press those seams open and flat. So just separating our back bodices away from our front bodice and opening these seams up and pressing those. Now we are going to pop our main bodice pieces aside and continue by repeating those steps for our lining pieces. Now before we go ahead and repeat those exact same steps for our bodice lining pieces, we are going to stabilize the back bodice buttonhole area by adhering a small rectangle fusible interfacing to the wrong side of our left back bodice lining piece, and we are going to be positioning those pieces of interfacing where our buttonholes will be placed at a later stage. So I have gone ahead and just marked my buttonhole placement marks out for my lining piece as well, and we are going to be working on our left back bodice lining piece with the wrong side facing up. So that is my right side there. We're going to be flipping it over. I've marked out where my buttonholes will be placed using that pattern piece again as a guide.
I have already cut and prepared 2 strips of interfacing as well. So these I have cut at a 1.5 inch width, and then depending on what size you are making, so for example my Myrtle is a size 7 length, so I have just measured the length between my buttonholes and have added a bit extra, so I have gone with 3 inches for the length of my interfacing strips. So we are now going to be placing those on the wrong side of our back bodice lining piece there, directly over where our buttonholes will be placed, and I'm going to press that down now. Once pressed, we are now going to work with our other back bodice lining piece as well as our front bodice lining piece too. So I have my front bodice lining piece right sides up, and just like before with our main bodice pieces, we're going to take our back bodice lining pieces right sides together and aligning the corresponding shoulders, repeating that for our second back bodice piece as well, and then we will just pin those in place. Next, heading back to the sewing machine, we are going to be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to sew exactly where we have pinned. Once sewn, we are now going to separate our back bodice pieces from our front bodice, and we are going to open up those shoulder seams and press flat. Next, we are going to be bringing back our bodice main pieces. So I have my front bodice here with my back bodice pieces attached, so I have it fully opened up. Now we are going to be taking our lining pieces that we just prepared, placing those right sides together and aligning our front bodices with each other and then our back bodices with each other as well. Now we're going to be pinning around the neckline and down the center backs by aligning our shoulder seams. So I have the shoulder seam of my main bodice pieces and matching that up with the shoulder seam of the lining pieces. Pop a pin in there, and I'm going to repeat that for the other shoulder seam as well. Then we're just going to continue aligning the raw edges of our lining and our main bodice pieces together and pinning the whole entire way around the neckline and down the center backs. Now once we have pinned the whole entire way around the neckline and down the center backs, we are going to head to the sewing machine using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to sew exactly where we have pinned. So once you have now sewn around the neckline and down the center back bodice pieces, now attaching our lining to our main bodice pieces, we will now be clipping the corners and also the curve of that seam that we have just created. So to begin with, we'll be clipping the corner of our back bodices, making sure to not clip through any stitching. So just going as close to that corner as possible and clipping like so, which will now allow our corner to turn out nicely and be really nice and crisp. Then we are going to repeat that for our second back bodice corner. And then we can go ahead and trim our seam allowance down to 1/4 inch and clip around that curve, or alternatively you can use pinking shears. For those of you who don't have pinking shears, you can just go ahead and trim the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch. And then just go in at the curve, clipping in towards that stitching line, making sure to not go through it though. Just get close enough to that, and that will now help that curve sit really nicely when flipped out the right way. I'm going to go ahead and complete mine using pinking shears though. So once we have then trimmed the entire seam allowance down to 1/4 inch and have clipped the corners and the curves or used pinking shears, we are now going to turn our bodice out the right way. and then just gently push the corners out of our back bodices. So I'm just using a blunt pencil to do that. Now once turned right side out, we're going to go ahead and press the entire bodice. Now once pressed, this next step is completely optional, but if you like, you can now go ahead and understitch around the neckline. I will go ahead and do mine now and come back to show you exactly what that will look like. So I have just gone ahead and understitched my neckline just as an example to show you how that will now look. So you are just going to be understitching on the lining side around the neckline. So there will be no exposed stitching from your main bodice pieces. And then on the inside, it will look something like this. So that stitch that we have just done will grab that seam allowance, holding it towards the lining. And when understitching around the neckline, you will just stitch down the back bodice neckline as far as you can towards that center back seam. So as you can see, I have stopped about there, and then about the exact same on the opposite side as well. So if you would like to go ahead and understitch the neckline, you can definitely go ahead and do that now. If you would prefer not to, then that is completely fine as well to leave it without the understitching. Next, we are going to be placing our bodice like so. So I have my bodice completely opened up with my two back bodices up here and my front bodice down here. We are then going to be separating our front main bodice and our front lining piece by just sweeping our lining up and underneath that towards the back bodice pieces. And then we are going to be bringing our corresponding back bodice main piece over now right sides together with our front bodice main piece, placing that on top to align the side seams and making sure to also separate our lining and our main back bodice pieces apart as well. So I have just my main front bodice and the corresponding main back bodice, and we are now going to align and pin those raw edges in place. So now that that is pinned, we are going to repeat that exact same step on the other side. So I have my front lining separated away from my front main bodice. I am then going to bring the corresponding back bodice across right sides together and separating my back bodice lining piece away from my back main bodice piece, and aligning just my main front and back bodice pieces together at the straight side seam and pinning that in place. So now that all of these side seams on our main bodice pieces are pinned, you will now just have your lining pieces remaining. So we are now going to repeat the exact same steps for our lining pieces. So I have my front bodice lining piece here. I'm then going to now bring the back bodice lining piece for the corresponding side, matching that up at the side seams and pinning those in place. And then repeating that for the other side as well. So just flipping our next back bodice lining piece over right sides together with our front bodice lining piece and pinning that side seam. So now that we have all of those side seams pinned, we'll have both of our back bodice lining pieces attached to our front bodice lining, and then our back bodice main pieces attached to our front bodice main piece at the side seams. We are then going to head to the sewing machine using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to now sew all 4 of those side seams that we have pinned. Now, once sewn, we can now open up those side seams and press those flat. So once all of those 4 seams have been pressed flat, you can now flip your bodice back out the right way. So this next step is another optional step, but if you would like to, we can now go ahead and baste around the arms eyes using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I recommend, if you are going to be doing that, to just firstly match up the side seams of your main pieces and your lining pieces and popping a pin in there, and then doing the same for the shoulder seams, so just matching up the shoulder seams of your main bodice pieces to your lining pieces and pinning that, and then go ahead and do your basting stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I will go ahead and do mine now and come back to show you exactly how that will look if you are wanting to do that step as well. So for those of you wanting to go ahead with that step of basting the arms eyes, this is what it will now look like. So as I mentioned, I like to just match and pin my shoulder and side seams, and then just continue around by aligning the raw edges of my main and lining bodice pieces together and basting that using a 1/4 inch seam allowance to keep those held together. So now to begin the construction of our little puff sleeves for our Myrtle dress, I have one of my main sleeve pieces here, and to begin with we are going to be sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches along this long curved edge. So the first row of gathering stitches will be a 1/4 inch away from this raw edge, and then we will complete the second row of gathering stitches 3/8 inch away from that first row. So I will go ahead and do mine now and come back and show you exactly what that will look like. So I have just gone ahead and sewn my 2 rows of gathering stitches along that long curved edge. So as I mentioned, one is a 1/4 inch away from this raw edge, and then the second row is 3/8 inch away from my original row of gathering stitches. Next, we are going to be bringing one of our sleeve lining pieces over, and we are going to be matching up this long straight bottom raw edge of our sleeve lining piece now to this curved long edge that we have just done the gathering stitches in. We will then be gathering the bottom of the main sleeve piece to now match the exact same width as the bottom of our sleeve lining piece. So once we have now gathered our main sleeve piece up to be the same width as the bottom of our sleeve lining, we are now going to flip that over so that now our fabrics are right sides together. And we are now going to be aligning the bottom gathered raw edge of our main sleeve piece to the long straight raw edge of our sleeve lining piece and pin those in place, making sure to leave 1/2 inch at both ends of the sleeve ungathered. So I have pinned the ends of my sleeve lining and my main sleeve piece in place, and then I've also popped another pin in 1/2 inch away from the end of both sides to make sure that they both stay ungathered in those areas. Now I'm just going to go ahead and continue pinning and distribute these gathers evenly. So now that we have pinned our gathered main sleeve piece to our sleeve lining, we are now going to head to the sewing machine using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to now attach those together where we have pinned. Now once sewn and both pieces are attached to each other, you can then go ahead and remove the gathering stitches And we are then going to go ahead and trim this seam allowance down to 1/4 inch. Next, we are going to open our sleeve out. So now we are looking at both right sides of our fabric. We are then going to be pressing that seam that we have just created up towards our lining fabric. So now that we have pressed that seam up towards our sleeve lining, we are now going to head to the sewing machine using a 1/8 inch seam allowance to now understitch along the bottom edge here of our sleeve lining. Once understitched, this is now what the sleeve lining will look like. So that understitching will only be on the sleeve lining side, holding that seam allowance up in place. So there isn't any visible stitching from our main sleeve piece. Next, we are going to be taking our sleeve and folding it in half vertically, aligning the raw edges and also the seams where our sleeve lining is attached to our main sleeve piece, and we'll be pinning those in place. Next, we are going to be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to now sew along this straight raw edge where we have pinned. Once sewn, we are now going to open this seam up and press that nice and flat. Once that seam is pressed open, we are now going to be taking our main sleeve piece over top of our lining piece, so now our wrong sides will be facing each other. I like to start by matching up the seam that we just created of both of our sleeve pieces and popping a pin in there. And now we're going to be working around the top raw edges of our sleeve pieces by aligning those together and pinning those in place. So once you have pinned your top raw edge of your sleeve lining piece to the top raw edge of your main sleeve piece, we are now going to head to the sewing machine using a basting stitch and a 1/8 inch seam allowance to now just attach those together. Now once you have basted both of the top raw edges of our sleeve pieces together, they will now be attached as one. Now we are going to be doing 2 rows of gathering stitches between the 2 notches on our sleeve lining piece. So the first row of gathering stitches will be 1/4 inch away from this top raw edge, and then the second row will be 3/8 inch away from that first original row of gathering stitches. So now that we have done our 2 rows of gathering stitches along the top raw edge of our sleeve, we are now going to be gathering our sleeve cap and then just leaving the tails of thread long so that we can adjust those when adding our sleeve into our bodice. So that is now one of our sleeves done. We are going to now use the exact same steps to create our second sleeve. So to now complete our second sleeve, we are going to be doing our 2 rows of gathering stitches along the bottom raw edge of our main sleeve piece. One at 1/4 inch away from the bottom raw edge, and the second row will be 3/8 inch away from that. Once we have done our 2 rows of gathering stitches, we will then be gathering the bottom raw edge of our main sleeve piece to be the same width as the bottom raw edge of our sleeve lining. Once gathered, we are now going to pop our 2 sleeve pieces right sides together, aligning those bottom raw edges. We'll now start pinning those together, making sure to leave 1/2 inch on either end ungathered. Now we'll just continue by distributing our gathers evenly and pinning in place. Once pinned, we are now going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance to attach our main sleeve piece to our sleeve lining. Once sewn, you can then remove your gathering stitches, and then we are going to trim this seam allowance down to 1/4 inch. Then once trimmed, we are going to separate our sleeve lining away from our main sleeve piece and press that seam allowance up towards our lining piece. Now we are going to head to the sewing machine using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance to understitch along the bottom edge of our lining. Once understitched, we are now going to fold our sleeve in half vertically, aligning the raw edges and that side seam and pinning in place. Then, using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we are going to sew along where we have pinned. Once sewn, we are now going to open that seam up and press it flat, and then bring the main sleeve piece over the sleeve lining so that the wrong sides are together, beginning by matching up the sleeve seams to each other and pinning those in place. Then just continue aligning our top raw edge of our sleeve lining to the top raw edge of our main sleeve piece and pinning in place as we go around. Once pinned, we can now head back to the sewing machine using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance to now baste our main and lining sleeve pieces together. Once we have basted those together, we are now going to be gathering our sleeve caps between the notches on our lining pieces using a 1/4 inch seam allowance for the first row of gathering stitches, and then sewing the second row of gathering stitches 3/8 of an inch away from that first row. And then once we have sewn our 2 rows of gathering stitches, we are then going to gather our sleeve cap up and just leaving those tails of thread so that we can adjust that gathering when attaching it to our bodice. So to now attach our puff sleeves to our bodices, we are going to start by turning our bodice out the wrong way. So we'll be looking at the lining of our bodice and keeping our sleeve the right side out. We are then going to insert that sleeve into the arm's eye opening, making sure that we match up the side seam of our bodice to the seam in our sleeve. And I like to align the raw edges of my arm's eye and my sleeve in that spot where the seams are, and quickly just pop a pin in that point. Then continuing on from that point where we have just pinned under the underarm, we're going to continue working up from under the underarm up towards the shoulder by just aligning the raw edges of our sleeve now to the raw edges of our arm's eye. Once you then reach the point where our gathering stitches start, you can then distribute those gathers evenly and then continue pinning in place. Once you've then adjusted those gathering stitches to fit in the remainder of the arm's eye, you will now have one sleeve completely pinned in place. So we are then going to repeat that for our second sleeve. So once again, having your bodice turned out the wrong way and taking our sleeve, making sure that that is facing the right way out so that our right sides of our fabrics will be facing each other when we insert it inside the arm's eye. So just popping that in and starting out by matching the side seams of our bodice to the seam in our sleeve, popping a pin in there, and then continue just pinning up until those gathering stitches. Then once you pin up until those notches where the gathering stitches start, we will then just adjust those gathering stitches to distribute those gathers to fit now into the arm's eye and continue pinning. Then once both sleeves are now pinned in place, we are going to now head to the sewing machine using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to attach our sleeve to our bodice. And then we will finish off this raw edge on both sleeves using an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. So once you have sewn the sleeve in and then have finished that raw edge using an overlocker or a zigzag stitch for both sleeves, you can then pull your gathering stitches out, and then we will be giving our bodice a really good press. Once pressed, we are now going to create 2 sets of horizontal buttonholes using the buttonhole markings that we have placed out on the left side of our back bodice piece previously. So I'm going to go ahead and do my buttonholes now. Just double check the size of your button that you are planning on using, obviously to make sure that the buttonholes are going to be the correct size. Once you have then gone ahead and completed your 4 buttonholes using those button placement marks on the pattern, you will now be looking at your completed Myrtle bodice. To begin the construction of our Myrtle skirt, I have my front skirt piece here right sides up, and I will be placing one of my back skirt pieces right sides down. We will then be aligning and pinning the short raw edges of our front and back skirt together. Once pinned, we are now going to head to the sewing machine using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to attach our front and back skirt piece together, and then we'll also be finishing off this raw edge using an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. Now is also an ideal time to add any size and care labels into the side seam as well if you wish. So I am going to be adding mine now and attaching that in this seam. Once you have sewn one of your back skirt pieces to your front skirt piece, now creating one of our side seams, we are now going to do the exact same with our second back piece. Now just make sure that when you are attaching your second back skirt panel that you are attaching it to the opposite end of your front skirt piece. So just completing those exact same steps by placing our second back skirt panel down on top of our front skirt, right sides together, and aligning and pinning these 2 short edges together. Once pinned, we are now going to head to the sewing machine using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then we'll also be finishing off that raw edge with an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. So once you have now attached both back skirt panels to your front skirt piece, and then have also finished off those raw edges with an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, we are now going to be working on the raw edge of the center back skirt pieces by now folding those over 1/4 inch and pressing in place. And then repeating that exact same step for our second back skirt piece. So folding that over 1/4 inch towards the wrong side of the fabric and pressing in place. Once you have pressed those raw edges in by 1/4 inch for both of the center back skirt pieces, we are now going to repeat that exact same step by folding up 1/4 inch along the raw bottom edge of the skirt as well, now to create the hem. So this is my bottom raw edge of my skirt here, so I have my skirt upside down to complete this next step, and I will now be folding that up towards the wrong side of the fabric by 1/4 inch and pressing that in place as well. So now that you have pressed up 1/4 inch along the entire bottom raw edge of the skirt as well, we are now going to flip the skirt over so that it is right sides up towards us. We are now going to fold one of our already previously folded center backs. Now this time we are going to be folding it right sides together and folding it by 1 inch and pressing that in place. Making sure at this step that the 1/4 of an inch that we previously folded and pressed remains folded and in place as well. Once pressed, we will now repeat the steps for the other center back as well. So now repeating that step for our second center back, we are folding that right sides together and now pressing that up a further inch. Then now working on the bottom edge of our skirt where we have pressed up a 1/4 of an inch already for our hem, we are now going to measure up 1 inch from that folded edge along this panel that we have just pressed, and we are going to draw a horizontal line across at the 1 inch mark. So as you can see, I have measured up 1 inch from this bottom folded edge up on the wrong side of the fabric where we have just folded. We are now going to repeat that for our second center back as well. So working from the bottom edge that we have already folded, measuring up 1 inch and drawing a horizontal line across. Next, we are going to head to the sewing machine and stitch along this line that we have just drawn, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and end to ensure that it is secure. So once you have now sewn along both of those lines that we have just drawn in, we are now going to flip the folded center back edge to the wrong side of this skirt again, gently pushing these corners out, and I'm going to repeat that for the second side as well. And you will now notice by flipping that over, it is now automatically flipping up a 1 inch hem, which we are now going to go around the whole entire bottom edge of our skirt and press that up by 1 inch to create that hem. I'm also going to now repress this center back folded edge back in place towards the wrong side of the fabric by 1 inch. Then, as you can see, it's creating a really nice crisp corner. So that is my center back now pressed back in place towards the wrong side by 1 inch. And we are then going to continue around the bottom edge of our skirt by pressing that up by 1 inch until we get to the other center back, and we will press that in place again as well. So now that I've reached my other center back, I'm going to just press that back over now towards the wrong side of my skirt by 1 inch again. So now that that is all pressed, we are going to head to the sewing machine to edge stitch down the sides of the center back and then across the hem using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. We will begin at the top of one of our center backs, sewing down that edge, pivoting at the corner to turn, and then sewing along the hem until we reach the other center back where we will pivot and then turn to sew up that second center back where we will end our stitching. So once edge stitched, this is what it will look like. So once you have sewn down one of those center backs down towards this corner and pivot, the stitching will stop where you pivot and then continue along the bottom hem of the skirt until you reach the second corner of our second center back skirt, and that is where you will pivot again to turn and stitch up the second center back. So that is now our skirts for today completed, ready to gather those and attach them to our completed bodices. So starting from one of our center backs, we are going to be sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches. One of those will be 1/4 of an inch away from the top raw edge of our skirt. From one center back across across the whole entire top to the other center back, and then we will complete a second row of gathering stitches that will be 3/8 of an inch away from the first line of gathering stitches, and that will also be from one center back to the other. So now that we have done our 2 rows of gathering stitches, we are now ready to gather our skirts. I should have also mentioned before to not gather the folded center back. So as you can see, I've started my gathering stitches just after that fold, leaving that completely flat. So now bringing back our bodice and completely opening that so that our back bodice pieces are away from our front and the bodice is completely open and flat. We are now going to gather our skirts up to be the same width as the entire bottom of our bodice. So I'm going to go ahead and do mine now. So once you have gathered your skirt to be the exact same width as the bottom raw edge of your bodice, we are now going to take our bodice and place our skirt right sides together, and we are going to start by aligning the top raw gathered edge of our skirt with the bottom raw edge of our bodice, making sure to also match up the side seams of your skirt to the side seams of your bodice as well, and pin those in place first. And then repeat that for the other side seam. Then I take the folded center backs of my skirt and align and pin that to the center back seam of the corresponding back bodice piece. Then repeat that for the second back skirt and back bodice piece. And then I'm just going to adjust those gathers and distribute them evenly between those spots that we have pinned. So once you have then distributed your gathers evenly and have pinned those to your bodice, we are now going to head to the sewing machine using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to attach our skirt to our bodice, and then we will also be finishing off this top raw edge using either an overlocker or a zigzag stitch. So once you have attached your skirt to your bodice and then have finished that top raw edge, you can also go ahead and remove any gathering stitches. Then we are going to turn our dress out the right way, and we are now going to press that seam that we just created up towards our bodice. Once pressed, we are then going to head to the sewing machine using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance to top stitch the entire bottom of our bodice, which will then hold that seam allowance up in place as well. Once top stitched, our seam will now be held up in place towards our bodice, and then all we need to now add to complete our myrtles is some buttons. So to now create the button placement marks, we are going to overlap our left back bodice over our right. So I'm positioning the dress as if it is being worn and making sure to align the side seams and then flatten my right back bodice, and then do the same with my left back bodice. So I'm aligning the side seams and flattening those so my side seam is right on the side for my left side and then also my right side. Now personally, I like to pop some pins in through my existing buttonholes to then create my buttonhole placement on my right side of my back bodice. However, you can use an air erasable pen through the buttonhole if you prefer. This is just what I find quick and easy for me. So I'm going to go through and just pop a pin through each of those buttonholes. and then lift my left back bodice piece, leaving my pins in the right back bodice piece. And then that is now where my buttons will be placed. So I will go ahead and attach my buttons now. So once you have then added your buttons to the right side of your back bodice, you will now be looking at your completed Myrtle dress.
Congratulations on now completing your Myrtle dress. I hope that you have enjoyed today's video and also sewing along with me. If you would like to sew along with me in real time, you can join our Facebook sew along group, where we split the construction of our dresses up over a matter of days and sew alongside each other. There are also amazing prizes to always be won at the end of each sew along. You can also join our main Peony Patterns sewing group as well, which I will pop a link to both of those in the description box below. This is where you can then share all of your creations made using any pattern by Peony Patterns, and also ask any questions that you may have. I hope that you have all enjoyed watching today's video and sewing your beautiful Myrtle dresses, and I hope to see you again very soon.